Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Welcome back. It is my pleasure to welcome our guest this week, Radley Balko. He is a columnist for the Washington Post and basically investor Javert from Les Mis when it comes to police misconduct. He has reported tirelessly for years and years about the problems with our criminal justice system, and he's almost directly responsible for freeing an innocent man from jail, from the death penalty. Reading his work is mind-blowing and often quite infuriating, but also incredibly important. Welcome, Radley.
Thanks. It's my pleasure.
The first question I want to ask you is a question that I ask all my guests, which is, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know, but we don't?
You emailed me this question, and it's a really good question. I think, I tried to think of a really good answer. The best thing I can come up with is don't be afraid to fail at things. I think we often are reluctant to try new things or to kind of put ourselves out there, take risks because we're afraid of failing. But failing in itself, I think, is good for us. It makes us stronger. It kind of, sets our expectations. It can motivate us. So I would say, if I could sort of, go back to your age and start over again, I would have tried a lot more new things. I would have, put myself at risk a lot more.
I definitely will be keeping that in mind. Jumping right in, I want to talk to you a little bit about forensic labs.
Mm-hmm.
People who like to watch TV shows like CSI, Bones, or Law & Order probably have the impression that forensic labs that work with the police do so to help them solve crimes and are amazingly precise all the time. Also, very fast. The scientists and medical examiners are also depicted as being devoted to searching for truth and justice. As a result, many believe, like I used to, that end fibers left behind, any bite mark, drop of saliva, blood spatter, or anything like that could land criminals in jail. So my first question is, how precise is forensic science?
Well, it really depends on the kind of forensic science that you're talking about. So, if we look at DNA testing, for example, DNA testing, if you've got one drop of saliva or one hair at a crime scene, and you have one suspect who claims that he was never there, and the DNA matches the suspect's DNA, then you know that the suspect was lying, that the suspect must have been there at some point, unless there's some other explanation. And DNA testing, was developed in the world of science. But a lot of the other forensic disciplines that you mentioned, bite marks, especially bite marks, things like fiber matching, which is different from DNA, tire tread analysis, all of these are what we call pattern matching areas of forensics. And these weren't developed in scientific laboratories. In fact, when scientists have looked at them, they found that they're not really all that accurate. In fact, a lot of times they can't even say how accurate they are because there's no margin for error. So if you look at something like fingerprint analysis, which everybody thinks is kind of the gold standard in forensics, the problem is that we actually don't know how unique fingerprints are. Nobody's tried to look at fingerprints over the entire human population to determine what the odds are that somebody might have the same set of fingerprints as somebody else. Or more likely what you get is these partial prints where you may match somebody else on 2 or 3 or 4 different aspects of a fingerprint. So what these pattern matching disciplines kind of boil down to is you have a forensic specialist looks at them, looks at a hair fiber or a carpet fiber or a bite mark, and they compare it to another hair fiber or carpet fiber or bite mark, and they just kind of eyeball it, and they say whether they match or not. And what we found is that a lot of these forensic experts are getting things wrong. They're getting things wrong in cases where they said that a bite mark was a match to the suspect to a scientific certainty or a high degree of scientific certainty. And then we found out later that through DNA testing that person couldn't have possibly committed that crime. So, what's interesting is the area of forensics that actually was developed in a scientific laboratory that does have scientific standards, it does have a margin for error that we can calculate, is showing us that all of these other areas of forensics that are more about sort of matching patterns and somebody, just sort of eyeballing two things and declaring them a match or not, the scientific discipline is showing that the less scientific disciplines have been getting it wrong. And anytime you're using sort of human judgment on something, there's a high degree of subjectivity to it, and it makes it the bias can creep in, right? If you're a bite mark expert and the police come to you and they say, we have this bite mark and from the crime scene, and here's the dental mold from our chief suspect, and we need you to tell us that they're a match, and you say, I can't tell you they're a match, they're not a match, or more likely there's just not enough evidence for me to say whether it's a match or not, they're going to be kind of mad at you, and they're going to go and try to find somebody who is going to tell them what they want so that they can solve the case, or what they think is solve the case. And so there's this incentive for some of these experts to tell police and prosecutors what they want to hear. And what we're finding is that hasn't always been in the best interests of justice.
You've written a lot about how, contrary to popular belief, many blood spatter specialists aren't as good as Dexter Morgan as he's portrayed in his show Dexter, or how bite mark specialists' insight should be taken with a grain of salt. You already spoke on this a little bit, but could you elaborate a little bit more and give us some more information regarding either of these?
So, I mean, in a lot of these cases, if you look at blood spatter, for example, you can't have. It's really hard to test your expertise in that area because we can't set up a fake we can't take a human being and say slash their neck to see how their blood spatters against the wall so that we can then test you on your competency with that, right? Because that would kill someone, or at least gravely injure them. And so blood spatter is another one of those where, yes, I mean there are physics to the way liquids sort of fly through the air, and there may be some kind of broad general statements that you can make about a blood spatter pattern based on how the droplets hit a wall, or what kind of pattern they make on the wall. But you can also, with bite marks, you can say, well, if there's a clear bite mark left on the victim, and the police chief suspect doesn't have any teeth, then you can say that person probably didn't commit that crime, or at least didn't leave that bite mark. So there are general things you can say. The problem is with a lot of these areas of speciality, the forensics people are saying much more than the evidence suggests, and they're offering their opinions with much more certainty than science would allow. And the problem with that is that juries find them very convincing. They're this is kind of the central problem, I think, with these kinds of subjective areas of forensics, where the person that the jury is going to believe is not necessarily the person who's using the soundest science, right? In fact, it's often the opposite. Juries like to hear people who say things with certainty. They like to hear people who say, this is the person that did it, or this isn't the person that did it. But usually the science doesn't let you say that. It can only say, I can eliminate this person as a possible suspect, or there's a likelihood that this person did it. Whereas that kind of uncertainty and ambiguity, juries don't like it. They don't tend to find it convincing. They like the expert who's going to say things with certainty, even though the science may not allow that.
Your work has also brought to light the fact that law enforcement manages crime labs, and the doctors and scientists that work for them face poor incentives that make their independence from the influence of law enforcement nearly impossible. Some of them also suffer from high levels of corruption. Can you give us a little bit more detail about these things?
Yeah, so this kind of touches back on something I mentioned earlier, which is that you have if you're a forensic specialist, and let's say, well, let's look at what's the case in a lot of the country, which is that the crime lab is part of the police department, right? So, at the end of the year your job performance is going to be done. Your performance review is going to be done by somebody who works for the police department, and inevitably they're going to judge your performance not based on how well you followed the science or how scientific your judgments were, your determinations were, but how often you helped the police solve cases. And that's not what we want scientists to do, right? We want them to go where the science goes. We don't want them to be help to see themselves as part of the law enforcement team or the law enforcement side of things. And so what we've seen is, in a lot of states, if you get accused of a crime and the crime lab has to do some sort of analysis to help determine your guilt, whether, let's say, it's a blood alcohol test to see if you were drunk while you're driving, or it's a drug test to see if some powder they found in your trunk is cocaine, or something more serious like they're doing a DNA test or a hair fiber analysis test. In a lot of parts of the country, if you are convicted, you have to pay a fee that goes to the crime lab to reimburse them for doing those tests. If the charges are dropped or if you're acquitted, the crime, you don't have to pay that fee, which is fair, right? You shouldn't have to pay a fee for a crime you didn't commit. But the problem is, if you look at that from the perspective of the people who work in the crime lab, every time they produce results from one of these tests that result in somebody getting convicted, they get money. Money goes to their lab and helps pay their salaries and helps keep the lab operating. Every time they produce results that get charges dropped or get someone acquitted, they don't get any money for their salaries or to keep the crime lab going. So that's a very strong incentive for them to produce results that help get convictions. And we've seen really all over the country, every year there's about a half dozen or more scandals where a crime lab or a crime lab analyst was caught faking the results for these tests. And it's kind of the same thing that I say about police officers and prosecutors. We need to, our system needs to treat them as if they are human beings who are capable of being corrupt or corrupted. It's not that all crime lab analysts are corrupt or that police officers are all corrupt or all brutal. It's that, they're human. And we have to have laws and a system that accounts for the fact that they are human, that they are fallible, that they are going to be susceptible to bias, to mistakes, and even to corruption.
And we're going to get into faking results and kind of breezing through results shortly. I have a lot of questions about that because it's kind of crazy. Before I do, I just want to say first that it's insane that this sort of stuff happens. It's nothing like I imagine or that anyone I know has even imagined at all. I mean, I can see the intention behind those incentives of, oh, you have to pay the fee for what the lab has done if you were proven guilty. But also, I mean, maybe this is just me looking in retrospect, but I see how it so easily could cause people in labs to fake data or just not even do the test and just say that the result is positive because it benefits them in the long run. I don't know. To me, it just seems obvious, but that's also me looking back.
Well, I think one thing you should consider. I mean, I think in a lot of these cases, it's not that they knew the person was innocent and they faked the data to make them guilty. In a lot of cases, they may just not have done the test at all and just said that the test was positive, right? A lot of times, that they may have thought a lot of times these people, they probably think that police, do their job well, and their hunches are correct, and they probably got the right person, and so they don't need to do the test. Or maybe there's a huge backlog and they just don't have time to do all the tests they need, and part of their job performance review is making sure that they get all these tests done, so they feel a lot of pressure, and so then there's this incentive to maybe cut corners or take shortcuts. So, it's not always I'm going to put this innocent person in prison, because if I don't, my lab doesn't get any money. It could be something, much less sort of egregious than that. But the end result is still that this person did not get a fair trial. And in some cases, it results in the convictions of innocent people.
So, what reforms do you recommend to make crime labs more independent and also to guarantee that justice is better served?
So yeah, so there are a lot of ideas. I think one is just that the crime lab should never be bureaucratically. It should never be under the control of law enforcement, of a police department, of a prosecutor's office. It should be independent, have sort of its own independent entity, or under some other government sort of umbrella that has nothing to do with the enforcement and prosecution of cases. Um, Another thing, and I think this is a really good idea that no one has really tried yet, that this guy Roger Koppel came up with. And the idea is it's called rivalrous redundancy. And what it means basically is that, so right now the incentive for these analysts, is to help the prosecution win their case, right? Even if it's a very subtle pressure, even if it has nothing to do with those fees, they're just sort of seen as being part of the prosecution's team. And that can creep into their work. Even if you're a really conscientious analyst, that can subtly sort of creep into your work. So one thing you could do is, um, every 4 or 5 or 6 cases, you would send the evidence to an independent crime lab, for to do their own analysis, right? And the people who work at the official crime lab would never know when their work is being double checked, right? So any case you work on, there's always a potential that it could be one of those, 20% or so that get sent to another lab for analysis. Well, now, the incentives are changed. Now that subtle incentive to sort of help the prosecution or help the police is overwhelmed by this incentive to not be proven wrong, right? To not be caught. You don't want to be the person who is in that 20% who get double checked and have this independent crime lab show that you screwed up, because that's going to be embarrassing for you and it's going to hurt your career. And so the idea is you would have somebody who's called an evidence handler in every case, and there would be the person who takes the evidence from the crime scene or from the police to the crime lab. And then every 4 or 5 cases, they would also take that evidence, a portion of that evidence, to an independent lab for verification. And you know, uh, the cost of this would seem to be pretty minimal. And I think Roger Koppel did the crunch the numbers and found that, for the cost of one wrongful conviction, when you consider, the money that goes into prosecuting somebody, defending that person, the appeals, and then compensating that person when we realize we got the wrong guy, you could fund a system like this for 15 or 20 years. So, it's really not that expensive in the grand scheme of things. And frankly, I mean, if it's something that would guard against putting innocent people in prison, and make it much, much, much less likely, which I think it would, it's well worth the cost.
That sounds like such a good idea. And I mean, if it doesn't cost anything but easily could save lives if someone is put on death row, that's good. But also, there's also the problem of people's time and their livelihood before they've been taken off death row. I mean, who knows what happened in jail?
Yeah, a lot of bad things. Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be free, but it would be. You'd basically be paying the cost of this evidence handler position. You'd probably need several people like that. So you'd be paying their salaries and benefits, and then you'd be paying these private labs for the cases that they analyze. But again, Roger Koppel crunched the numbers and found that, in this, when you weigh that against the cost of convicting an innocent person, it's relatively inexpensive.
So, Before we switch to talking about the militarization of the police, I wanted to ask you about falsifying data and things like that in forensic labs by medical examiners. So, single handedly, there's something that you brought to everyone's attention, which is Mississippi's medical examiner, Stephen Hain. Can you tell us a little bit about him? His story is so complex, but so, I don't know, it seems outlandish, but it's reality. I know there's quite a lot. I mean, I spent hours reading all these different examples of the stuff he's done because he's gone through so many autopsies and falsified results are just gone too fast and so many of them that there have been so many mistakes made. It's crazy. Could you give us some of the craziest examples or just some examples of the mistakes he's made?
Yeah, so he was the medical examiner in Mississippi for about 20 years and did about 80% of the autopsies in Mississippi over that period. And, this is one of those systems where when there was a suspicious death, the coroner and the prosecutor got together and they hired a doctor to do the autopsy on a case by case basis. And Hain came to dominate that system because he told prosecutors and police chiefs and coroners what they wanted to hear. He gave them what they needed to prosecute people in these cases. And so, the problem with that is that one, he was doing an insane number of autopsies every year. I mean, you should do at the absolute maximum, a medical examiner should do about 300 autopsies per year, and that's pretty cutting it pretty close because if you figure there are 365 days in the year, and you count for weekends and holidays and being sick and vacation, that's doing more than one a day, and autopsies are really difficult work. He was doing 15, 1,800, even over 2,000 per year in Mississippi, which is just crazy. I mean, it was like an assembly line basically. And so he was cutting a lot of corners. He was getting things wrong. And then he was also just giving testimony that wasn't really backed up by any science. And he was stating things that he had no business, stating in court. When talking about sort of the trajectories of bullets, when talking about the marks that various, murder weapons leave on bodies. And then he had this sidekick, Michael West, who often worked with him, who was a dentist. And West was proclaimed to be an expert in all kinds of crazy things. He claimed that he could find, indentations on your hands that would show that you had been, that you had used a knife to stab someone 2 weeks earlier, but he also, claimed to be an expert on bite marks. And in this case, a guy named Tucker Carrington and I wrote a book about this. Hain and West together helped convict these two innocent men in Mississippi in the early 90s of the rape and murder of two little girls. And they both, spent decades in prison. And, it's a terrible, terrible story. But in those cases, and then in at least two other cases that we found, we have video in which this Michael West, this dentist, takes a mold of the teeth of the suspect and pushes it into the body of the victim and actually creates the bite marks using the suspect's teeth or a mold of them, creates the bite marks that he would then later say in court that the suspect had inflicted on the person when actually West himself had inflicted them. And, it's crazy that we found these videos. And, in one of those cases, the guy is still on death row in Louisiana. The case still hasn't been overturned. And frankly, I mean, West should be arrested for that. I mean, that's, you're desecrating a body, but you're also manufacturing evidence to convict someone. And, in at least a couple cases, we know that those people turned out to be innocent. So, basically, it's a terrible story. Dr. Hain was eventually fired, but, there's still hundreds, probably thousands of cases where his testimony was very questionable. And the state of Mississippi refuses to go back and look at those cases and reevaluate them. It's basically up to the people who are convicted in those cases to find a lawyer to try to get a court, to reopen them. And that's not what should happen when when somebody like that is shown to be willing to lie and to give testimony that isn't backed by science. It should really be up to the state to figure out how much damage was done and to try to find people who were victims of that and to set them free or try to make them whole for the damage that's been done. And Mississippi has had, shown no interest in that whatsoever. Um, I guess just the party probably concluding thought about that is Dr. Hayne actually died a few months ago. West is still alive, though he doesn't testify in court anymore. But these guys did a heck of a lot of damage in Mississippi, and we really don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know exactly how much damage they did.
This is insane. For the longest time, I couldn't even wrap my head around it because just why? To go so far as to manufacture evidence like that and to think that all the people that were walking free or are still walking free because of the wrong people being convicted, just because of this manufactured evidence or this autopsy that was performed the wrong way or under the wrong circumstances, it's it's heartbreaking, but it's also kind of scary. It was weird because as I was reading, I wanted to laugh, but I also couldn't stop thinking about how awful it was. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was Hain that said that a given suspect had, or it might have been a victim, and that he had inspected the ovaries, but it was actually a male. And that's how he assessed the crime. It was just so crazy.
It was an infant, and yeah, and Haynes said that he had inspected the ovaries and it was actually a male. In another case, Hayne talked about how he weighed the spleen and carefully noted offered a description of what the spleen looked like. He talked about how it was healthy and looked normal, and the guy had actually had his spleen removed, 15 years before he died. So, it was again, some of this I think was um, intentional, and they were trying to lie, and basically they were just trying to help police and prosecutors close these cases. And they also wanted to continue to get their business. In some cases, I think it was just sloppiness. They were just doing so many autopsies that inevitably, they were going to make mistakes.
So you kind of touched a little bit on this before, but how is the justice system involved in this process? Because I mean, it seems kind of obvious looking at it that he kept testifying even though he was discredited. And he would cite studies that never actually happened. So how is it that the justice system is involved in this entire process?
Well, so they are, I guess, technically part of the justice system in that they did autopsies, official autopsies for the state. But the other places that the justice system is implicated here is that the prosecutors shouldn't have been using them to do these autopsies. They should have been seeking out more credible doctors and specialists. Mississippi is supposed to have a state medical examiner, where a qualified, board certified forensic pathologist administers the autopsies in the state, either does them him or herself, or has staff to do them, or helps choose qualified doctors to do them. And for a long time, the state legislature just refused to fund that office, or at least to fund it adequately. In fact, that's still going on in Mississippi. So they deserve a lot of blame. But also the courts. In our book, we interviewed the Chief Justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court, who was the Chief Justice for most of this period where Hayne was there. And, today he says that he screwed up. He says it was a huge mistake, that they should have been much more, much less reverent toward Hayne and West. That they should have been, they should have applied some scrutiny to them. They should have been more suspicious of what they were claiming. And they just didn't. And he says, it's a huge, huge regret and a huge mistake in his career. But it isn't just him in that court, right? The Mississippi appellate courts, the Mississippi circuit courts, and the federal courts. The federal courts have also failed, in their duty. Well, let me back up a little bit. The U.S. Supreme Court has basically said, when it comes to science in the courtroom and determining what is legitimate science and what isn't, that they're just going to trust judges to do that. And, the problem with that is that judges aren't scientists, right? Judges are trained to do legal analysis, not scientific analysis. And they've done a really bad job of keeping bad science out in the courtroom, partly because when they're asked to do these analyses, they apply a legal framework instead of a scientific framework. And a legal framework is they basically say, have other courts allowed this in? And if they have, then we're going to allow it also. And that's how the legal system works, right? We look at precedent and prior cases. But science doesn't work that way, right? Science is always changing. A lot of these areas of forensics weren't, as I said, weren't started in science laboratories or in the field of science, and science has just now gotten around to sort of testing them and showing that they're inadequate. But the courts look backward, whereas science looks forward, and so judges have done a really bad job at keeping bad science out of the courtroom. And I'll say with Hain and West, I mean, in a lot of these cases, the science is difficult and it's complicated. And, when you look at like DNA, like I said, when you have one source of DNA and one suspect, you can say whether or not that's a match. Pretty much, it's pretty much foolproof. But what happens when you have 4 or 5 or 6 different sources of DNA and one suspect? Then the question becomes sort of, you have to start weighing them, and that gets really complicated. And asking judges to do that, it's a mistake to ask judges to do that kind of scientific analysis because they're just not qualified to do it. But with Hain and West, it really wasn't that complicated. I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to know that if there's a video of a guy using a dental mold from the suspect to create bite marks on, the corpse of a victim, that isn't science, right? That's manufacturing evidence. And yet the courts just refuse to sort of intervene and refuse to hold these guys accountable. And as a result, we have, uh, basically a generation's worth of cases in Mississippi that I think are tainted because these guys testified at the trials.
We could obviously continue talking about this for a really long time because it goes so deep and there's so much there and there's so many aspects to this problem. But now I kind of want to move on and talk about the militarization of the police because that's also a really important aspect of this entire problem. It's also another area where you've done a lot of work to tip the balance towards better justice. It's a pretty vast topic also. So let's start with the basics. In the United States, we have always thought of military and police as two separate entities. So, what is the militarization of the police? When did it start and why did it start?
So, militarization of the police. I think there are two aspects to it. One is stuff, right? Gear and weapons, and we look at the police are increasingly sort of dressing like soldiers. They're wearing camouflage and they're wearing these kind of uniforms that are more designed for a battlefield. They're being armed more like soldiers, right? They're getting bigger guns and weapons. They're driving these militarized trucks that are sort of designed to look intimidating. They use flash grenades. They use other kinds of explosive devices, crowd control devices, all kind of stuff that's used or was originally designed to be used in a battle setting or in warfare. That's one problem. And the other problem is, I think, what you might call the mindset problem. And that's that police are increasingly sort of adopting the mindset of a soldier. A soldier's job is to kill people and break things. It's to annihilate a foreign army, right, or enemy. Ideally, what we want police to do in a free society is to protect our rights, right? Their job is to to promote public safety while protecting the Constitution. And those are two very, very different roles and two very different jobs. They're not interchangeable. And if you're good at one, that does not necessarily mean you'll be good at the other. But I think we've increasingly, and particularly, in politics, we've increasingly asked the police to kind of act as soldiers. We tell them they're fighting a war, whether it's a war on crime or drugs or terrorism or Antifa or whoever. And we also constantly tell them how dangerous their job is, that there's danger lurking around every corner. When actually policing has been getting safer for about a generation now. And so what that does is it instills this very sort of battlefield mentality among police officers. It makes them think that every interaction with the citizen could be their last, that everybody's a potential threat, instead of, how we want police officers to be thinking of us, which is that we are all citizens with rights and we're people who they work for and who they are supposed to be serving and protecting. And the result from that is, I think the two play on each other, right? If you're dressed like a soldier and armed like a soldier and told you're fighting a war, you're going to start to see yourself as a soldier and not as a peace officer. So I think the gear kind of feeds into the mindset. Um, and so the problem is that then police, they're more willing, they lose their tempers more quickly when you sort of see everybody as a potential threat, when you think that every interaction with the citizen could be your last. You're going to be more willing to reach for a weapon sooner. You're going to be less likely to sort of trust people. You're going to be less likely to use de-escalation or conflict resolution tactics. You're going to basically resort to force and more force much earlier. And that's, I think, where, I think policing is heading. People often ask me if police have gotten better or worse over the last, whatever, 20, 30, 40 years. And I think, in some ways they've gotten better in the sense that, um, rogue police officers are less likely to sort of beat people. I think on in general, I think there's still a lot of racism in policing, but I think they're probably much less racist than they were, in the 1950s or 60s or 70s or 80s even. Um, but what has changed, I think, is the amount of force that they're legally permitted to use, and the number of situations in which they're legally permitted to use force have expanded pretty dramatically. The fact that we use SWAT teams for all sorts of very low level crimes now. That's, I think, what we should be worried about. It's not that necessarily police are more corrupt or more um, sort of willing to break the rules or go rogue. It's that the amount of force and violence that we allow police to use under the law and under police department policies has expanded, and that, I think, is probably even more worrisome than the other.
So let's dive into a recent example that demonstrates the consequences of the militarization of police. At this point, we've all heard about Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old black woman who died in Louisville in a hail of bullets when the police served a no-knock warrant on her home. There were no drugs in her house. She wasn't the target of the investigation, but as a result, she died. Can you give us a little bit of backstory on what happened?
Yeah, so the police were investigating an ex-boyfriend of hers, a guy named Jamarcus Glover, and um, he was actually in custody at the time that they conducted the raid on Breonna Taylor's apartment. Um, so the police, they get they're doing this investigation. She kind of gets sucked into the investigation, basically because Jamarcus Glover had received some packages at her home. And it's true. She used to date him. She was trying to sort of get him out of her life. She was trying to, um, you know, get rid of bad influences in her life. She had started dating a guy named Kenneth Walker, who was her family and friends thought was much better for her. And so she gets sucked into this investigation because she lets Jamarcus Glover get a couple of packages at her house. Turns out they were from Amazon. They were clothing, had nothing to do with drugs. And yet the police didn't really look into that. And in fact, one of the officers on the affidavit for the search warrant claimed that the postal inspector in Louisville had told him that the packages were suspicious, which we now know was a lie. The postal director said that nobody in that office had ever said anything like that to a police officer. In any case, her former relationship with Jamarcus Glover and the fact that she let him get a couple packages at her house, packages mailed to her house, was enough to sort of bring her into this investigation. The interesting thing is, she was deemed a low enough level threat that the SWAT team didn't even serve the warrant. The SWAT team served the warrant on Jamarcus Glover, a couple of other people, but she was determined to be, a pretty low level threat. So instead, these narcotics officers, who are not part of the SWAT team and are not trained like a SWAT team, they end up conducting the raid on Breonna Taylor's house. And by all accounts, including the account of Kenneth Walker, who was home with Breonna Taylor when this happened, the police did knock. They banged on the door for quite a while. I think it was 30 to 45 seconds. But Walker says he didn't hear them announce. And about a dozen neighbors who lived in the same apartment complex or around it also said that they heard the knocking, but they didn't hear the police announce themselves. One neighbor initially said a couple of times that he didn't hear them, and then on the third interview with police, changed his mind and said, "Yeah, maybe did hear them say police." From that, the narrative that emerged from the police department and from Kentucky's Attorney General was that the police did knock and announce themselves, and that therefore this was not a no-knock raid. Um, I think that's wrong. Kenneth Walker says he didn't hear them announce that they were police. And so from his perspective, it was even worse than a no-knock raid. From his perspective, somebody was banging on the door violently in the middle of the night and not saying who they were. And so I think he had every reason to be scared. And so what ends up happening is they take a battering ram to the door. It flies open. Walker and Breonna Taylor, wake up. They're terrified. Walker fires a couple of shots, ends up hitting one officer in the leg. The other officers then open fire, and the bullets hit Breonna Taylor and kill her. From the argument from the police that this was not a no-knock raid, the whole purpose of the knock and announce requirement that says the police have to knock and say who they are before they can, break into your house, that it gives you the chance to realize that they're the police, to come to the door and to let them in peacefully and avoid violence, right? Well, if Walker didn't hear them, then that means they weren't saying that they were police loud enough for him to hear. And to claim that he should have heard them or that he shot at them knowing that they were police doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, there were no drugs in the house. He had not done anything wrong. He does not have a criminal record. So, in fact, he's a registered gun owner. And hardcore criminals tend not to register their guns with the police for pretty obvious reasons. So, you have to believe that this guy who was a registered gun owner who had not committed any crime, was not suspected of any crime, there were no drugs in the house, just decided for no reason that he was going to take on a, heavily armed police team that was raiding his girlfriend's home, armed with only a handgun. And then he was going to shoot a couple of times and then immediately surrender. That doesn't make any sense. The far more plausible explanation is that he was scared and confused and didn't know that they were police. And in fact, that's bolstered by the fact that he knew about Breonna Taylor's ex-boyfriend. He knew that he was a drug dealer. He knew that he was a problem, and he knew that Jamarcus Glover was not happy about the fact that the two of them were dating. So he had every reason to think that whoever was trying to break down that door was there to do him harm. And that's really the problem with these raids. There's a very low margin for error. They're volatile. They're violent. If one thing goes wrong, there's a very, very high chance somebody's going to die. So to do them for drug crimes, these crimes that are nonviolent and consensual, and that that don't involve an imminent risk to somebody's life or safety. These crimes, it just doesn't make any sense. These kinds of tactics are appropriate if you have a situation where somebody is an imminent risk to harm somebody else. So, a kidnapping or a hostage taking or an active shooter situation. Excuse me. Because in that situation, you're using violence to diffuse an already violent situation. When you use these tactics to serve warrants for drug crimes, you're creating violence and confrontation where there was none before. And not only that, you're doing it for basically to investigate somebody who is still suspected of committing a nonviolent consensual crime. And with an active shooter, somebody's in the process of committing a crime. When you serve a drug warrant like this, you haven't even charged the person yet. You're still investigating. And so it's just a completely inappropriate tactic for that sort of crime. And, Breonna Taylor is not at all the first innocent person to die in one of these raids, and she won't be the last as long as they keep up.
This is just absolutely awful. He was using a licensed firearm, and still she dies and wasn't the target. It's depressing. It's so sad. It's just awful. This morning I was reading, actually, that 2 officers involved in the shooting had received notice that they were to be fired.
Yeah, that should have happened a long time ago. But yeah, so one officer, the one who's also been criminally charged, he was charged for sort of wantonly firing into the house from the outside without knowing what he was shooting at. And that's a crime, and he should be charged with that. The other officer who's probably going to be fired is the one who procured the warrant. And like I said, he lied. He lied on the affidavit, and that's when you file an affidavit as a police officer, it's considered you're under oath. And he claimed that the postal inspector had said that these packages were suspicious, and that clearly never happened. So I think it's entirely appropriate that those two officers be fired. And frankly, I think the other one should probably be charged with perjury as well.
And also, something I was reading is that both of them now have the chance to contest these terminations under their contract with the police union. So, what is the role of the police union in the militarization of the police and in these circumstances, and what are the consequences?
Well, there's a lot there. Well, basically, yeah. So, like any police, like any union, the police union's job is to protect the interests of its members. The difference between a police union and, say, a auto workers union is that when police union negotiates with the city, the people who are negotiating on behalf of the city don't really have a direct stake in the outcome or the unintended consequences of where those negotiations may go. So if I'm the CEO of Ford, say, and I'm negotiating with the union, and I give the union, I give too much to the union, right? Well, now Ford is going to suffer, and that's going to be reflected in the way the board looks at how I'm doing my job. If I'm too stingy with the union, then maybe the workers go on strike, or maybe they're unmotivated. Production slows down, and I get punished for that. So there's a strong incentive for me to do things sort of properly and to try to strike that balance. If I'm negotiating, if I'm a politician, a mayor, say, or a member of city council or city manager who's negotiating with the police union on behalf of the city, there are real restrictions about, first I'm negotiating with taxpayers' money, right? I'm also negotiating with public safety. And so what often happens is if a city can't give police what they want in terms of salary or benefits or pensions, they compensate by giving the police less accountability. They make it more difficult to fire bad officers. They make it more difficult to review officers for for red flags. And generally, what happens is when something goes wrong, when a union contract that lets bad cops off too easily starts having the effects that you would expect it to have, which mean more police brutality, more unjustified shootings, that sort of thing. The person who negotiated that contract isn't in office anymore, or even if they are, voters tend not to blame, a mayor or a city council for these types of things. They tend to blame, the police chief or a lot of times the people who are doing the blaming tend to be civil rights activists, racial justice activists, the people who they're not people who generally sort of would have voted for the types of candidates that police unions support in the first place. So there's a real problem with sort of who benefits from these contracts, who gets hurt by them. The people who get hurt by them tend to have very little political power. So police unions have become extremely powerful. Even people who oppose most of what police unions are for, even people who are very pro police reform, tend not to vote on those issues, right? Whereas police unions, that's all they vote on, and they have a lot of power. They have a lot of concentrated power. So if a police union decides that they want to come after a politician, a city councilman, for example, they can turn out a lot of votes, and they can hurt that person a lot, even if the position that the police union is taking isn't supported by a large majority of voters. The people who do support the police union vote, early and often. And so politicians are afraid of them. They're afraid to stand up to them because of that political power. And, the way that translates into things like militarization, I mean, one big way it does is in the mindset side of militarization. So police unions, they have a strong incentive to enforce what's called the blue wall of silence. And this is the idea that police officers should never, rat each other out. They should never testify against another officer. And there's a very strong incentive for police unions to enforce that culture and to make sure, because their job is to defend officers who are accused of wrongdoing, and if other officers are doing the accusing, that makes things very difficult for the police union. So they have a strong incentive to enforce this idea of a blue wall of silence. Um, I think they're destructive. I think police unions they are obstacles to reform. They defend bad officers. They make it more difficult to fire bad officers. And as we're seeing in cities across the country now that have elected more kind of reform oriented mayors who have then appointed reform oriented police chiefs, the unions have then gone after those mayors and police chiefs and tried to get them, either defeated at the polls or, in the case of police chiefs, removed from office. So they're a very, very entrenched political interest, a barrier to reform. And I think, as long as they remain as powerful as they are, that's going to be difficult to get a lot of police reforms pushed through.
That just sounds absolutely awful. I mean, just awful. I talked to Clark Neely at Cato too about qualified immunity around the time of death of George Floyd. It's all been building up to something, and there's just such a need for change. I just think we really need to fix it, and we need to fix it well, and ideally the first time we try to fix it. So, really fast, I know we're running out of time, but can you give us a short summary of the story of Corey May and how your work helped to set him free?
Sure. So this actually it touches on both of the issues we've been talking about. So Corey May was in 2000, four, I believe. Was 21 at the time, living with his girlfriend and their infant daughter, or young 18-month-old daughter, in Mississippi. They lived in a duplex, and on the other side of the duplex, there was a guy who was a known drug dealer. And the police had done a controlled buy from this guy using a confidential informant. And, whether they didn't realize it was a duplex or just didn't care, they raided both sides of the duplex on, I believe it was the day after Christmas in 2004. Corey woke up in the middle of the night. It's about 12:30 a.m. His daughter was on the bed. His girlfriend actually was working at the midnight shift at a factory, so she wasn't home. But the police kicked down his door, and Corey shot and fired, killed one police officer, then immediately surrendered. They found a tiny bit of marijuana in his apartment. They were actually looking for cocaine, so it's clear that they didn't, they had the wrong apartment, or he shouldn't have been raided. But he was immediately arrested. Actually, first they beat him, and then they arrested him and charged him with capital murder, which is the intentional killing of a police officer. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to death. I found his case in 2006 while I was working on a paper for the Cato Institute on police militarization and these SWAT raids, or these drug raids in this case, and wrote about the case. It kind of caught on, went viral. Eventually, a big law firm in D.C. called Covington & Burling took up his case pro bono, hired their own investigators. And, one thing they found was that, at Corey May's trial, the medical examiner who did the autopsy on the officer who was killed was Stephen Hain, of course, because he testified in all these cases. And he gave this testimony about basically saying that, Corey said that he was scared, he was on the floor, and he fired up at the officer. And Hain said that the trajectory of the bullets through the officer's body didn't support that they supported the idea that Corey was sort of laying in wait and basically sort of pounced on the officer. And it turns out that testimony was not supported by any science. The trajectory of the bullet could have been affected by any number of things, and so it should not have been portrayed in a way that it impeached Corey's testimony and his narrative of what happened. And basically that trial boiled down to whether or not the jury believed Corey when he said that he didn't know that this was a police officer that was breaking into his house. And, it's very similar to Kenneth Walker in the Breonna Taylor case, in that, there's one of two things happen that night. Either Corey, a guy who was not a drug dealer, had a tiny amount of marijuana in his house, woke up, heard that there were cops breaking into his house and knew they were cops, for whatever reason, decided to take on a raiding team of armed cops with just a handgun, shot and killed just one of them, and then surrendered with bullets still left in his gun. That's one story. The other story is he woke up terrified, didn't realize that these were cops, thought he was being invaded, shot and killed an officer, and then as soon as the police announced that they were police, immediately realized what he had done and immediately surrendered and apologized, which he did. The second story made a hell of a lot more sense to me than the first one. And so I started writing about it. Eventually, he got the death sentence was thrown out. He was resentenced to life in prison. And then I believe it was 2012, 2013, maybe. Mississippi Supreme Court overturned his conviction, said that he should have been able to argue that he was defending his daughter's life that night. And at that point, Corey had been in prison for, I don't know, I guess about over 10 years. And so the prosecutors agreed to let him plead to a manslaughter, which is a felony. But if he agreed to plead guilty to that they would not try him on, as retry him for murder, and they would give him time served, which means he would get out of prison. And so he got out and got to go home to his family, and to his kids. But, at that point, he had been in prison for 10 years. He still has, he'll have a felony on his record for the rest of his life. And so, that's one of the, we sort of look at that as one of the just outcomes in these cases, because he did get out and his conviction was overturned and he wasn't executed. But I would argue that, that still is injustice. I mean, this guy lost 10 years of his life. He lost 10 years of his kids' lives of being a father to his kids. And I think it's just another sort of example of how the militarization of police, this idea that cops should just be able to sort of kick down doors in order to enforce, drug laws of all things. It's been tragic, and it affects, certainly affects the family of the officer who was killed. They're never going to get him back. It certainly ruined Corey's life. It affected the lives of his kids, his mother, his family. And all because, we think it's so important to stop people from, using drugs that we think we should be able to sort of break into their houses in the middle of the night with guns. It's all really absurd.
Those circumstances are just terrible because he can't work, he can't vote. I mean, he can work, but really it's going to be way harder for him to get a job. So it kind of ruins his life. And maybe this is just because I've just finished applying to college and all of that stuff being a senior, but I was just thinking about it, and if he wanted to get into college, it would be more difficult for him because he would have to explain the entire story before they would even consider his application, which seems awful because really it was self-defense. He had no idea what was going on. He wasn't really a target at all. Like, he was involved for no reason, and it's ruined his life. So many people face the same thing that he faced, and many of them haven't gotten their lives back or didn't get their lives back in the end. They might not have gotten time back. He lost a lot of time. It's all just awful. It sucks.
Yeah, a lot of killed. I mean, if Corey was lucky. I mean, you pull a gun on police as they're breaking into your house, and doesn't even have to be a gun. It could just be something that looks like a gun or that they think is a gun, and you're lucky to survive the next 20 seconds. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people have been killed in those situations, and certainly, yeah, a lot of them who did manage to get a shot or two off ended up, facing charges and going to prison.
So, I have one final question just to wrap up the discussion. What is one thing that you believed at one time in your life, but you later changed your position on, and why?
Yeah, so there's so many of these. I grew up in a very conservative part of Indiana, and so my politics were much more, traditional conservative. Today, I'm more of a libertarian, and the issues I think important are probably more to the left side of libertarianism. But I think one thing, just kind of in general, is the idea that that people in positions of authority got there for good reasons, and that therefore we should always sort of defer to them, whether that's police or prosecutors or judges. I think a lot of times who gets those positions has more to do with, what family they were born into, or the color of their skin, or In some cases, corruption gets people into higher offices. And, so I think the whole way I kind of think about, um, and this is, I think I stopped thinking this way probably in college, but the whole way I think about sort of, um, what level of sort of deference and respect we owe to people in those positions has changed as I've learned more and more about how people get those positions. And I'm not an anarchist, and I'm not trying to make a very simple kind of don't trust anyone over 30 argument. It's more just that I think we need to understand that um, this idea of respect the office, I think is when you learn kind of how people obtain those offices, we should be much more skeptical and dubious of the people who hold those positions and why they make the decisions they do.
I really like your response. I usually take the skeptical approach and consider myself actually very lucky that I've always kind of thought that instead of having to learn it. I don't know, I'm very skeptical about things. It's a part of who I am, I think. In a way, it can be harder, but it can also be really helpful. Well, thank you very much for all the time that you spent talking to me. Not just the time you spent talking to me, but all of the time that you've taken fighting for people and fighting for reform and informing people on these sorts of issues that really, without you talking about medical examiners and stuff, that wouldn't even really be an issue people were aware of, people were thinking about. Me, at least. And, well, lots of people that I know. So again, thank you so much. Also, and to my listeners, go read his stuff because it's so moving. I mean, it's so descriptive, and I don't know, it's so brutal, all of the stuff that he writes about, that you will be shocked. Um, Thank you for coming on today. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And these are really great questions. Probably the best questions I've ever had in a podcast. So you did great work too.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you to everyone who listens, subscribes, and shares the Great Antidote podcast. If you would like to be on the podcast or have a guest in mind, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@thecgo.org. We have some great things in store for you, and I'm really excited to be back, and I hope you are too. Thanks.